Hello, my name is Sarah Walton. I'm the BSI Sector Lead for Sustainability and Net Zero. Thank you for joining us here today for a replay of this webinar about the Flex standard for net zero transition plans for SMEs and the accompanying Net Zero Standards Community Hub. We've just started working on version 2 of this Flex, taking into account all of the comments we received in the public consultation about clarity, examples needed, and explanations on terms and condition and definitions, and also about other initiatives and how they all fit together. Today, after you've seen the webinar about the areas covered by the Flex, Ian Byrne, the advisory group lead and technical author, and the others who were involved in the first webinar about SMEs and the net zero transition on the panel, who you'll be introduced to in a moment, are going to be here again to outline some updates on the project and its expected impact, provide perspectives on the current situation for climate action and the net zero goals for SMEs and others that the Flex is aiming to provide help with. We'll also be looking again at how to enter and use the Net Zero Standards Hub to assist you in your organisation in net zero transition. A key point to take away from all of this is that BSI has decided to provide this online Flex standard as a free resource for the many SMEs that make up our economy. And this is because BSI's purpose is to have impact for a fair society in a sustainable world. And we want to do this by helping to improve businesses, protect consumers, and work with governments. So this work on net zero transitions is designed to be as responsive to the concerns of SMEs specifically as possible to help them in achieving their net zero transition targets. So what you'll gain today, we hope a good understanding of the Flex standard, how it was created and how it can be used, some ideas on some practical steps that small organisations can take to reach net zero, and further information about standards and other key resources available via the Net Zero Standards Community Hub, as well as how that hub can be used to share questions and solutions amongst the community. We hope you find this webinar both useful and illuminating, and the panel and I will see you at the end of the session for an in-person wrap-up with any other questions you might have for them once you've watched the video. Thank you very much. I'm in the webinar.
Hello and good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah Walton. I'm the BSI Sector Lead for SMEs and Net Zero. Thank you very much for joining us today at this discussion webinar about the Net Zero Flex accompanying Net Zero Standards Community Hub. Can I get the next slide, please? Thanks very much. And actually, no, I think we can go to the next one because that's me. So next slide, please. Today we're going to consider how this standard can help you in practical ways for your journey towards net zero, and how to enter and use the Net Zero Standards Hub to assist you in your organisation in net zero transition. One key point we hope you'll take away from the webinar today is that although standards are not intended for use just and only by big organisations, but for organisations across the supply chain, this particular Flex or online standard is aimed at, and so hopefully very responsive to, the concerns of SMEs specifically. Things we aim to cover in this discussion panel today are key challenges for SMEs. How does the Flex assist in assessing and prioritising actions for net zero transition? The experiences and insights of our panel here today in helping their own and other organisations in the transition to net zero. What will participants gain from today? We hope a really good understanding of this Flex standard and how it was created and how it can be used. Some ideas on practical steps that small organisations can take to reach net zero. Some further information about standards themselves and other key resources available via the Net Zero Standards Community Hub, as well as how that hub can be used to share questions and solutions amongst the community. Of course, it's also an opportunity for you to ask questions about the experience of those on the panel, both those who've been involved in drafting the Flex so far, the standard so far, and those who've been asked here to reflect on their own challenges and what they need to help assist in their own work. Next slide, please. So before I introduce our panel, just a few bits of housekeeping. This is being recorded. It's a CPD recognised webinar, and we aim to answer the questions you have about the topic, the Flex and the Hub, some of which were forwarded, thank you very much, prior to this webinar, and some of which will doubtless occur to you as you listen to this discussion. And you can put all the questions in the Q&A function, and we'll aim to get to as many of those as possible during the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. We'll also conduct a couple of polls throughout this session. So as well as asking questions via Q&A, you'll have an opportunity to give us some feedback as we go along, and some of your thoughts as we go through. And now we have about up to an hour and a half for discussion and questions, which hopefully will give us plenty of time to explore key challenges and issues and talk about how the Flex and Hub work. Moving, next slide, please. Thanks very much. So moving to our discussion, this is our panel today. Some of whom won't be speaking, in fact, Philippa won't be speaking, but I'm quickly going to ask everybody to introduce themselves. Actually, Philippa might speak, now I said that, who I will just ask you to all introduce yourselves, and you'll meet them all properly as we enter the discussion. So to start with, over to you, Ian Byrne.
Hello, thank you, Sarah. My name's Ian Byrne. I'm the technical author for the Flex 3030. So I'm the guy who's actually been responsible for putting all the words together. For a very quick way of background, I've been working in sustainable energy now for over 30 years and in the carbon space for probably 20. So I've seen a lot of things in the past, and hopefully bringing that as a positive experience rather than as a negative one. And I'm based in Milton Keynes, where I run a small consultancy looking at helping largely small public sector organisations reduce carbon footprints and get on the pathway to net zero.
Thanks, Ian. Chloe.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Chloe Fiddy, Senior Policy and Engagement Lead for Climate Change and Energy, and also the topic of social sustainability at IEMO, which is the professional body for people who work in the environment sector and sustainability. And yes, I was a part of drafting this this Flex. So yeah, really happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks, Chloe. Elizabeth.
Hello, thank you. So Elizabeth Smith, I was recently promoted to ESG Director for Inks Europe. So we manufacture inks for packaging, including aluminium cans. So new to the subject of net zero, climate change. So hopefully I can give you an insight into the challenges that we've had as an SME. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. James.
Hello, my name is James Hand. I'm the co-founder at Geeky. We're a B Corp and a social enterprise, and we help companies raise awareness about sustainability and help people find the actions that they can take in their everyday work.
Thanks, James. Sasha.
Hi everybody, I'm Sasha, so I'm the Community Manager and I look after our SME Net Zero Transition Hub. So here really to help and support our members and connect them as well.
Thanks, Sasha. And I'm very sorry about earlier, Philippa. Philippa, please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Philippa Morell, and I'm the Editorial Project Manager responsible for working with Ian and the AG to deliver this particular standard.
Thanks, Philippa. And I'm Sarah, and I've already introduced myself. So before we jump in, a few words about the Flex and the intention behind it. Could we have the next slide, please? So following a fair amount of engagement and explorative research, BSI, as the NSB for the UK, that's the national standards body for the UK, undertook to provide a freely accessible standard as a practical tool for SMEs to use. The idea was to provide step-by-step recommendations on how to go about undertaking the transition towards net zero, to supplement guidance from other official sources, including the Transition Plan Task Force and other key initiatives like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The benefits of using this Flex process, this online standard process, is that it's very responsive to change. It's very agile and quite quick to deliver. We delivered this first version from first undertaking the project post-research in around six months. It can be updated very quickly, and we can respond fast to users' comments and feedback easily online, knowing that whilst we do so, the existing version remains there as a BSI standards tool that can be used by anybody. And still, it remains current, even though you can give feedback on it. We have an accompanying supporting online community hub that we mentioned before, and this is called the Net Zero Standards Hub, which is designed to support the development of the Flex and facilitate wider industry engagement, encouraging discussion and sharing of best practice. And there'll be more about that later. Sasha will tell you a lot more about that. The hub is basically an interactive resource pointing to other key net zero standards tools, like the recently published BSI Net Zero Barometer 2024, which is research that BSI has been undertaking over the last 4 years on net zero readiness in the business community, both large and small organisation. And there's a lot more on that hub, and we're going to hear, as I say, from Sasha more about that later. Now, before we get to some specific questions, and I'll also be bringing in questions that were asked by participants before the webinar to see if we can address any of those today too. We'll have a quick poll just now, if you don't mind, just based on some of those questions that came in earlier, and to give you a chance to sort of get your hand in and start interacting with us. Thinking about the transition to net zero and your own organisation's role in this, which emissions are you currently thinking about with regards to reduction? Which are your actual focus? If you could vote now on these 5 options, and you can tell us as many of those as you like. One, several, say several. Thanks very much. Great, thank you very much. That's really interesting responses. And the way we think about these particular individual types of emissions is something that obviously we're aiming to really sort of cover practically in the Flex. So now I'm just going to go over to Ian. First of all, Ian, can you tell us a little bit more about the Flex, the process of development, and what you think of as its key features that are going to help SMEs in their net zero journeys?
Thank you, Sarah. I think I'll start by saying just a few words about the process of development. The idea of the Flex has been running around for a little while within BSI. There's concern that there's a lot of documents that are out there at the moment, but some of them are targeted more at large companies or very large companies, such as public quoted companies, which have perhaps a large number of people who can already concentrate solely on matters like reducing their carbon footprint or the transition to net zero. But that there's rather less out there that works for smaller organisations who may not be able to have such a dedicated resource. It also became apparent that a lot of the information that was out there was targeted largely at reporting. So it was about telling the world what you've done rather than about how to do it yourself. And that always to me slightly seems putting the cart before the horse. So we identified that there was probably a place in the market that a flexible document would actually be very helpful to mainly smaller organisations, and they can be for profit or they can be not for profit. And indeed, as I said in my introduction, in fact, a lot of the time I've been working with small public sector organisations, and it can work for them as well as for companies or even sole traders. So that was the sort of the background to it, and BSI did some very useful research and scoping to find out what was out there first. And then basically it was a question of sort of trying to pull together a first draft of a document to actually say, well, we know broadly what we should be doing. We've seen what some other people are saying about what's a good starting point on the journey to net zero. So we put together that. As technical author, I produced a sort of very rough draft, which we then bounced backwards and forwards including to the advisory group. And I think someone actually referred to it as the AG earlier on. If you hear us sort of slipping into things like acronyms that we shouldn't do, then I apologize for that, and we'll try and avoid doing so as much as possible. And the advisory group, who represented quite a wide range of interests, came back again with some very interesting and very helpful suggestions. So that was where we got to the first draft of the Flex. Now, of course, that's all about process as opposed to what we actually find within it and what it's trying to achieve. Essentially, it's trying to give these smaller organisations a straightforward way of being able to identify what are the steps they need to take to get towards net zero, to take part in the transition, and also perhaps look at some of the opportunities that might exist along the way. So it's not just about sort of more imposing sort of more requirements or more difficulties, it's actually also opening the door for opportunities. In practical terms, the Flex leads you through in a fairly logical order. First of all, it expects you to make a management commitment. And even if you're just a company of one person, as I am, it's actually important to recognise what you're trying to do. It's quite possible for me to commit to do something in my company, even though it's me. So that's the first step. And then behind that, there are some key principles which should underline any transition towards net zero, whatever size of organisation you are. Once it's gone through that, the Flex then sort of takes you through a fairly logical process. So you start scoping what you're actually trying to do or trying to encompass within the net zero envelope. So is it just the entire company? Is it just part of it? Is it going to be everything? We encourage you to go as far as you possibly can to bring in as many different types of emissions, including the scopes we saw obviously at the moment, scope 3, and particularly those relating to emissions associated with the use of goods or services are harder to capture and fewer people are looking at those. But once you've done that, you then need to sort of set a straightforward target. It also gives a bit of guidance on targets, because at the moment it's very easy to say, well, the target is net zero by 2050 because that's what the government says. But actually you need as an organisation to be able to look in more detail at that and to say, well, actually, how would that relate to me? Can I be quicker? Are there areas that I need to pay particular attention to in doing that? Once you set a target, you then identify actions. Once you identify those actions, you hopefully go about implementing them. And the actions are things that will generally reduce emissions. So they may be quite straightforward things like energy management, energy efficiency, switching to renewable energy sources, or they may be slightly more esoteric if there's any opportunities, for example, removing carbon dioxide from within your operations or within the assets that you own. And then finally, once you've done that, you have the opportunity, if you wish, but it's very definitely an option, to look at offsetting before you assess your impact and then go round the loop again. So once you've assessed the impact, once you've recognised what you've achieved, what perhaps hasn't worked quite as planned, the Flex effectively tells you, go again, start looking again, modify the plan if necessary. These things are not cast in stone. Things change. We recognise that.
Thanks, Ian. So do you think it's, and we had a question earlier, do you think it's feasible or possible to become net zero as an SME? Shan?
Frankly, without decarbonisation of the electricity supply, no. But if the government and all major parties are committed to it in this election, does indeed achieve the decarbonisation of the electricity supply by whichever year it is, 2035, 2030, 2040, then yes, it is possible. A lot of that will, of course, actually involve switching away from burning fossil fuels. So from no longer using gas or oil, or for a few of you still do coal, towards electricity. And it may require some changes to processes and some changes to the way that organisations sort of go about their business. But by and large, it should be possible. And it should be relatively straightforward once we've got a decarbonised electricity supply. There may still be a few residual emissions that are not technically or economically feasible to eliminate. And those so-called residual emissions are ones that may then subsequently have to be sort of counterbalanced by offsetting towards the end of the process. But by and large, it is possible for most companies to do it, as I said, with the important caveat of the electricity intensity.
Thanks very much, Ian. So I'd just like to bring Chloe in here. So Chloe is the Policy Engagement Lead for Climate Change and Energy at IEMA. I believe IEMA did some recent research with SMEs about their key challenges for net zero. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about those. You mentioned 5 specific ones that came up and how you think the Flex maybe could help small businesses with those challenges that they come up with.
Yeah, thank you. So we last year we sort of came up with the same conclusion, which was that SMEs really have these huge challenges of knowing where to start, and we put together some guidance for SMEs, which is sort of available to our members and other people as well. So we started by surveying a number of our members and some of the clients of our members. And we spoke to around 50 SMEs, which was quite a good sort of across sort of different sectors. And the way we did the interviews, they were not structured with fixed questions or anything like that. We just thought it was really an open interview, and we sort of analysed the responses. And absolutely what we found was that everything that the SMEs told us they were struggling with grouped into five problems. And one of the top concerns was understanding what the reporting requirements were. So we found that people were really anxious to know if they were doing the right thing. So what we found was that people, obviously it was a fairly self-selected group because people were engaging with us already, but they wanted to do the right thing and they didn't know what that even looked like. The next big concern that people had was how to build an evidence base for senior management. So often what we found was that for SMEs, it was often a highly motivated individual that was working in the organisation that was trying to kind of do something on looking at what their emissions were and what could happen to change and how to kind of get the resources or at least the engagement of senior management. That was kind of often a barrier. Target setting was the third big one. So sometimes SMEs just didn't really know how to start with setting good targets. Knowing what good looks like isn't always obvious. The next big one was when they're looking at understanding their scope 3 emissions, engaging with supply chains. So that came out as a huge issue. If you're a supply chain, if you're an SME, it's quite hard to, you haven't necessarily got the clout that a bigger purchaser might have with the supply chain. And then finally, the sort of good practice reporting formats were a question, and whether they needed to sort of have their data verified and processes validated and so on. So it was, that what does good look like in terms of reporting format? Do we need, does it need to be, do we need to get somebody independent come in and check it? So these are all the sort of concerns that people had, and I think this Flex is going to be really helpful, and certainly when we update our guidance we will be pointing people to this Flex. I think it's a good resource.
Great, thanks very much, Chloe. In fact, and there was one of the questions that came up, and I know it was something that we discussed in an earlier focus group that everyone here was at, was what people's thoughts are on when the UK government may or may not introduce legislative requirements on SMEs, on reporting and energy reduction. Can I ask anybody on the panel what their thinking is on that?
I mean, I can jump in with a thought on that if you like. I think so. Having spoken to the team at the Cabinet Office that designed the procurement note 0621, definitely their concern is about making it really well balanced. So they want it to be easy enough to do without excluding SMEs, but not so easy it's not worthwhile. So I know that is something government's really aware of, as making it sort of approachable as a process. I don't think any government's going to want to make it too hard for that reason. You sort of end up just kind of pushing people out of it if it's too difficult. I mean, and I guess the next thing on that is that we've got a general election coming up, and wait and see where the next government, whoever that might be formed of, where they decide to go with that in terms of how high on their list of priorities it is. But I think probably our view really at IEMA is that it will be other market players that are pushing SMEs probably faster than the government will. but maybe the other panelists have thoughts on that.
No, I agree with that actually. What we're finding is that we are aware that legislation is coming for SMEs. However, at the moment, the main drivers for this come from our stakeholders, particularly our customers, particularly when we're dealing with bigger customers who've got a lot more resource and they're focusing a lot more and they're further ahead with it. They're then expecting us to perform or have certain data available, and at the moment we're not able to resource it or provide that. It's a massive challenge.
In fact, I was going to ask you, Elizabeth, as the new ESG director of your organisation, what do you see as the most pressing concerns for your organisation around net zero? And is it about when you might be expected to meet legislation, or how you're going to match the needs of your own supply chain, your suppliers, or are there other and customers, or are there other considerations and priorities that are going on for you?
I think there's a few challenges at the moment. One is measurement data collection is a huge challenge for us as a business because we haven't got the same resources as larger companies have, and even finding out or sort of a level of understanding of what is required is a huge challenge for an SME, because again, you've not got the same resource, time, and it's a significant burden to us as a business as well. The other thing is, like I say, sort of understanding and interpreting the legal requirements that are required, because again, it's a resource and it's a burden, and then interpreting those so that everybody within the business understands what it is that we need to do, when we need to do it, and how we're going to be able to meet those requirements, not just sort of now, but almost in the future as well. So you're future-proofing the business and reducing the risk to the business. And it's a huge drain on a resource, because you've simply not got the same resources, people available in a business who are able to spend time in understanding what the requirements are and being able to perform this as an additional task when SMEs are already having to comply and do a lot of work, and quite often they've just not got the spare capacity to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really key point, and I don't know how you feel the Flex sort of addresses that currently, or is that something that really needs to be considered in the next version? Because another question that we had was that came in before was it's such a challenge to get SMEs involved in net zero initiatives. So any tool that is there has to be something that they can follow. So what's your thinking about that?
I think the good thing about the Flex is it gives you an overview and an understanding of what the requirements are, and I also like the fact that it signposts you as well to other supporting documentation, so that it then enables you to see where else you can find the resource, because even that in itself is a challenge for a business. I've been in this role a couple of months, and it's trying to understand where the information is, what's the best source of information, because at the moment we've got to recognise there's a huge amount of resource available, webinars and things, because it's such a huge topic, but we haven't got time to attend all the webinars. So it's really, we need somebody who can quickly signpost where we need to go, where the best sources of information are, so that we can best utilise the time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's something to cut through, and obviously those are things that there's a challenge for us, in developing something that can be really useful in that way. So if I sort of opening up the question, to everybody else sort of on the panel a bit. So the recent sort of net zero barometer research and the research that IEMA has done, I think probably stacks up to a similar result, but we found that around half of SMEs have apparently started to do some work on policy and action around net zero, but 2/3 of larger businesses have. I don't know what everyone's thinking there is, but perhaps I can go over to James actually now, just as someone who works with businesses to help them make effective changes to enable the organisation to become net zero. Would you say that understanding what is expected of them is really one of the key challenges here for SMEs?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's something that goes through all behavior changes. Having an achievable goal and a method to achieve it are the foundations of getting people to change. And when they have that, it's quite amazing how quickly people learn, they iterate, they improve, but they have to have that framework. And in this case, it really is about that, having a methodology that people can go to, as Elizabeth was saying, that kind of is signposted to other places, that is from a reputable organization, basically people can trust. That's really key, that it's clear, that's really key, but also increasingly that it's also used by their peers. All those things together can kind of really help the people kind of get behind a methodology. And within that, I think for us and for everyone on the call, remembering about just how important the language that we use is, especially around technical language. So if you say to one of your colleagues, oh yeah, we're going to look at scope 3, category 7, don't expect anyone to get excited. Tell them that you're going to be looking at commuting and home working emissions as a way to cut carbon. Then you're going to get a bit more just understanding of things. So I think, yeah, all that, yeah, what's expected, the language that we use, making it relevant to people, those are all really crucial, and why I think the Flex is a really important part of that.
Yeah, avoiding jargon is kind of a key part of this, I think. I mean, we've, you know, I think we talked about, I know that when we talked before, we talked about sort of actionable and realistic targets for SMEs, and what we think those, you know, what do you think those ought to be? And obviously the language there is going to be key. But what is there anything else that you think that you would mention at this point?
I think, yeah, the that word you used, that actionable. So putting together the strategy, but then giving people things that are relevant in their everyday roles that they can do, really helps them to take action. So I think, yeah, that's important. Also, another one that's often forgotten a bit in sustainability is just time. We hear so often from people that sustainability for them is like a side of desk project. This is at big organizations as well as small ones. And that's not okay when you look at the scope of what we all need to do. So I think, but yeah, the most important was relevant and actionable. You do that, and people will really get behind what companies are trying to achieve.
Thanks, James. This is one for sort of everyone on the panel. What in your view should SMEs consider as their first practical steps in transitioning to net zero? You know, we've talked about resources, time and money being at a premium, and even more so now. Is there a first kind of step you'd advise on it for everybody?
Yeah, can I say, I think the first step is just actually to decide to do something.
Yeah.
In posh terms, that's described as being top management commitment, but in practice, it's making the decision to actually get engaged to do something. And then, of course, once you've done that, I think probably the next step is to say, well, where are our emissions coming from? And it doesn't have to be a detailed footprint. One of the advantages of this not being aimed as a reporting standard is that we don't then actually have to get everything down to the last I dotted and T crossed. It's important for people to concentrate on what they can do, and you know, as we've heard, we don't want it to be a side of desk project. We want it to be actually something that people can integrate into what they're doing in every day. And if that means that sometimes they have to perhaps be a little rough and ready, it's better to be doing that than to be doing nothing.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to come in on that, or is that kind of cover off what
I would agree with the concept of just sort of obviously making the decision, but then starting with a sort of a broad look at what you're doing. because you might quite quickly see something that could be, an easy win, and that will kind of give you a bit of momentum for keeping going. But yeah, so I mean, I sort of hear of organisations, they say, oh, we've got, I don't know, X number of sites, but we're going to put solar panels on this one. And I sort of think, well, I say, have you looked at your, your whole organisation? That might not be the first place you want to spend your money. You might have vehicles or something that need updating, or, so I think it's about understanding, getting a grasp of what your actual, where you are, before jumping in to make decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. Before we sort of go on to talk more about the subject of resources and alignment between the Flex, I would be really interested in the thoughts of all of you, the participants here today, our audience, about which resources you yourself have used so far. So we have another poll, just to kind of gauge, because we're wanting obviously to make sure that we are really kind of trying to be that, be practical and helpful here. So we want to know the sorts of things you're looking at or have looked at, and you can pick any one of those. So perhaps you could give us a sense of what you've been looking at so far to help you. Thanks.
I'll just chip in at this point, given that we're trying to avoid using 3-letter acronyms. And 50,005 is phase implementation of energy management system, and it's a standard that's been made available freely to SMEs by the UK government, which is why it's on the list.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really sorry. I reduced that down to EMS, which is it is exactly that, energy management system, because we didn't have much space for the poll. So, but it is it's freely available, that standard at the moment, the phased implementation for smaller businesses. Oh, not so many people in it, but it is free, so bear that in mind when you're looking at it. So thanks very much. So people at the, yes, obviously I've expected the greenhouse gas protocol and SBTI are quite heavily used. So yeah, thank you. That's very helpful for us when we're thinking about the language we're using. Several people, in fact, before the webinar asked about links between the Flex and protocols and guidance like the Race to Zero and the TPT, that's the Transition Plan Task Force implementation guidelines, and also the ISOs. So Ian, could I ask you now to explain a little bit more about how the Flex refers to those key resources?
Yes, it refers to them within the text at the appropriate point, and then there's obviously a bibliography at the end, which gives you sort of how to access them. But essentially what we're trying to do within the Flex is not to go away and reinvent any wheels, and so we want to point to people at the appropriate point to what we consider to be the appropriate resource. We recognise for a lot of smaller organisations that may be something that's a little bit less well known, such as the UNFCCC's Race to Zero, which is targeted very much at smaller enterprises. But it can also include things that have come with the support of the UK government recently, like the Transition Plan Task Force. They have sort of provided some implementation guidance a little while ago, and I believe have recently just introduced something specifically now for SMEs. But then there's also ISO standards. ISO 14064 Part 1 is sort of the basic organizational calculation standard, which covers much the same sort of ground as the greenhouse gas protocol. So again, we're pointing within the document at both those alternatives.
Thanks, that's helpful. And there was a question previous to this, was how much does it cost to implement net zero measures in an organisation? And this one I'm going to hand to the whole panel to have a think about answering, but does anyone want to kick off with that? Ian,
I mean,
sorry.
We've not actually calculated how much it's going to cost, but I think the the difficulty is that if you don't look at it now and start working on this, it'll cost significantly more in the future, and the risk of not doing anything is significantly higher. And I think that's the way that we've looked at it and approached it as a business, because we can see our stakeholders and the legal requirements are going to increase in the future. So we sort of see it as an obligation. It's not a choice, really.
Right. Yeah. And anyone else? Who else would like to have a?
I think my answer to that was how long's a piece of string, really, because of the fact that some measures cost virtually nothing, particularly behavioural measures. If you can sort of get people to switch things off, which are not needed, for example, and have an immediate payback. Other measures can be very expensive, and I guess again the whole point about trying to go through a formal planning process of writing a transition plan is to actually be able to identify which are the quick wins, which are the ones that we can do easily that don't cost a great deal, which are the ones we're going to have to seek investment for, or which are the ones that perhaps might even get us to rethink our business model a little bit, so that if we're spending a vast amount of money on first-class airfares to Las Vegas for conferences, do we actually have to do that or not? Maybe we do.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah. Chloe?
Oh, I was going to just sort of jump in and agree about, how long is a piece of string, but I think obviously there's the time cost of putting the baseline together, and, maybe a resource cost if you're getting people in to help with it. But if you're a very small business, don't overlook seeing what your local authority has to offer in terms of advice and grant funding. So before I joined IEMA, I was a climate officer at a local council, and since I left being an officer, I became elected, so I'm now a district councillor as well. And there are grants available. We have grants available for small businesses to help do things. I was in town recently, and a small business owner said, "Oh, I got a grant to upgrade my commercial fridges. That's really saving a lot of energy." He said, "I can't believe all the businesses in town aren't applying for these grants." So I would say look around and see what there is, because there might be more out there than you even know about. So don't be afraid of finding out what the costs are. There might be help with it.
Yeah,
if you're a small business.
Yeah,
that's a very good tip.
And just to echo that, this is such a crucial part for businesses, because we're not going to get to net zero if there's an assumption that's going to cost more. And the answer is it costs depending on the project. So the cost benefit analysis, the grants that were Chloe just mentioned, the behavioural changes which are free around waste reduction, energy efficiency that Ian mentioned, and then the longer term investment projects around, like solar panels were a good one that was highlighted there, and the payback period within that. So there will be things where the cost benefit analysis is positive or strongly positive, and it's finding those ones that businesses can then really key on, not an expectation that you have to pay the green premium. It's got to be a green discount, it's got to be a good ROI, and then you get kind of speedy businesses will then move quickly to respond to that.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's those are very good points, all of them. That there are ways of looking at this, and in fact, somebody we had questions about how you make, and I know Chloe, you referred to this. People are looking for how do you make an evidence case for senior management, and those are the sorts of things I assume that would really help build into that in some way. Now, I think if anyone has anything else to say on any of those sorts of points right now, please do chip in. Otherwise, I'm going to probably hand over to my colleague Sasha, who's the community hub manager, in a moment. So, do we anything further right now, or can we do a quick run through of the community hub? Well, there'll be other questions in a short while, so we can refer back. We can come back to the points in a bit. So over to you, Sasha, for now. Talk about the Net Zero Standards Hub community, describing its key features and benefits.
Perfect. Hi everyone, and thank you very much, Sarah. So what I briefly wanted to cover is a little bit about the purpose of the community. I'll do a quick demo, as you can see me getting prepped now, and then share a little bit about the resources that we're going to have in the hub after the webinar. So really the community has just launched, so we launched last month officially, and it's there designed to support the development of the Net Zero Flex, but also to bring together some of the key stakeholders to discuss some of the challenges, to share the best practice, and to connect essentially our members with the community itself. So you can see, I hope, my screen. So this is the homepage. Once you come in, you can have a little look about what it's covering, and then when you are ready, you just follow the sign features. We do have some content available more publicly, so you'll see the blog. We've got a bit of an insight here from Ian and from Sarah around the Flex, but essentially most of the content will be member exclusive, if you like. So once you log in, you'll be in the homepage. So this is what the homepage is like, and it essentially provides a bit of a bird's eye view of all of the key development taking place within the hub. You'll see some of the latest blogs, latest discussions, and then an overall feed of the activity. It will pull together everything that's kind of relevant or you're part of within the community. And then the main part is here. So you have the top navigation menu, the actual Flex itself. So the first version and the second version, which is coming up, is developed within the hub. And this is what the advisory group space is. So that's kind of exclusive for the advisory group who are involved in the development of that. And Ian and kind of Philippa work quite closely within this space. If you'd like to be more closely involved in the standard, please do let us know. And then we'll also share opportunities on how to feedback or kind of share your thoughts within the hub in the next few months as well. And then you have the key areas of the discussions. At the moment, we've started quite slimline, if you like. So really the focus is around some introductions. We've got an area for the net zero transition news and updates, and then we have standard specific updates in there as well. I just want to highlight the introduction. So please do head over and just say hi. This is a really good place to see who else we have as members, to share a bit about what you're working on, potentially what some of your challenges are. And then on our side, we can start to connect members, start to see what sort of support they might need and kind of how we can potentially match that. I've seen that we've had quite a few members already join as the webinar has been happening. So yeah, head over to the space and say hello. It'd be great to see you in here. We then have the resources section. So in here, you'll see the first version of the BSI Flex 3030. You're able to download it. We also have the net zero barometer that Sarah mentioned earlier. You can view and download that, and then there's some other resources in there as well. I think the intention with the hub is broadly for it to be that central resource for SME net zero transition, both in terms of the documents that we're working on, but we're also keen to see what you're finding useful, or potentially if there's a white paper or a report that you're working on, or that you found a resource that was really helpful to you, we'd be really happy to upload it here and kind of share it with the members, or if there's a particular section. We then have the blog, which I mentioned earlier. We're intending to kind of share some of the key updates in here. Mostly it will be around the development of the Flex and what's coming up, but also if there are certain questions or there's certain areas that potentially we're looking at establishing some case studies in this space to kind of help and support SMEs, they'll be in here. So there's room to kind of provide support for you, but we're kind of looking at seeing what those challenges are and how best we can really do that. And then you've got the event section. So again, similar to the resources, there are events that are kind of we're running and that we're doing as BSI and as part of this Flex. But also we're keen to highlight the events that are happening across the industry that are relevant. So again, I can see that V's already been in there, and she's added the London Climate Action week climate tech event, which is happening on the 25th of June. But again, if there are events that you're attending, events that you're hosting that are specifically related to this topic, please either add them in here, or you can email me or kind of Sarah, and then we'll get them added on your behalf. It's a good opportunity to see who else is attending, to potentially connect with some of the other members in there as well. The one that I do want to highlight is new member welcome and networking. So each month we'll do a new member welcome and kind of networking, and it's a 30-minute drop-in session where we can answer some of the questions. We'll do a bit of a brief intro on the community, but also it's a really fantastic opportunity for you to meet some of the other members that we've got in there. Look at kind of the common challenges, how other members might be approaching some of those, and what they're looking to do with regards to their net zero transition. We tend to keep these quite small, so there's 15 people max per event, just so people are able to connect, but we'll have them monthly. So if you're interested, you can RSVP, get going. And I think that covers most of it. The last thing that I just wanted to say was, again, thank you for everyone who's registered. I'll be approving the ones that have come in that I can see as I've been speaking in a moment. You will find all of the details after this webinar in the community. So the recording, aware there was lots of questions that came in initially. Hopefully we'll get to most of them today, but if not, we'll look to address them in the hub. If there's anything that pops up after the event, again, please feel free to kind of head in, go into the discussions. You'll be able to start your own topic, select the forum, and then you can kind of post any questions, resources, details in there. You'll see a window which is quite similar to this. And I think that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sasha. And just to sort of reiterate, that hub is there for people to share their experiences and thoughts, and with the community of similar people who are dealing with similar challenges, and also from our perspective as the standards body, we're hoping this is about us collaborating and working with our stakeholders, so that this is for you to as well. So you saw there's Tech UK. I'm hoping IEMA will put some things in there as well. And, we've got this is there for our stakeholders to be able to also have another route to sharing with their thoughts and with you, and you sharing back and asking questions. So so please do take advantage and use that community. The other thing I wanted to say was on the subject, in fact, Sasha mentioned this earlier, on the subject of really effective ways to help support you in your efforts using the hub. It'd be really great to let us know. She mentioned the questions. I doubt we had lots and lots of questions beforehand, and I suspect we've probably got quite a few coming in now. But what we thought was we would answer those. We'll try and address some of those in the hub, or at least some, maybe all of them. It depends. There were a lot of questions, but it would also really help us to let us know if there are some clear examples or case studies for transition to net zero, which could be helpful to you. And we'd really sort of appreciate our final poll today is just to ask you which of the following sorts of areas would be of most help to you if you had some clear examples. Would it be, and Chloe has mentioned this in the research that IEMA did, how you begin a journey, how to set a target year, how you put together a business case, which is the thing that we sort of reiterated a little while ago, and how you might start a conversation with suppliers, customers, but I didn't put that one on there, but yes, but suppliers in the first instance. Which sorts of examples of case studies would be really helpful in the hub? A few moments to answer that. many people feel that any of these things would be useful. If there's something I didn't put an other question, so maybe you might want to follow up in the feedback after this this webinar, or even in the Q&A now, with something that would be of help for you in beginning this work. So thanks very much. That is very helpful though. I think we can turn to some more of the live questions now from the session and have a look at those. There were a few questions before the webinar, and there was one particularly, actually, just to sort of kick us off, about tools which might help with spend-based methods and other resources. And I should just mention here that if you're talking about budgets and spend-based methods, before we get to the question, if you're a Federation of Small Businesses member, you should note that you can access all of the standards for a fairly big discount at the moment. There's currently an offer for Federation of Small Businesses micro-organisations to access all the standards in our directory for a big discount of about $360 a year. So if that's of interest to you, there'll be further information about that after the webinar, but that's on the subject of cost. Back to the actual question. Tools to help with spend-based methods. Are there? What sort of things would you suggest, Pamela?
I mean, this is one of the challenges that we've got at the moment. It's assessing what tools are out there and what's best for us as a business that will integrate into what systems we've got. So I'll be really honest, at the moment we're relying really on data that we're pulling from SAP, because we've got SAP, and then plugging it into an Excel, but we know that that's very much a short-term measure. And this is things that we're looking at the moment. You know, what are the tools that can better help us and support us in producing the information that we need to.
Right.
There are a large number of tools out there actually being marketed, you know, with dashboards and links to databases. It's quite difficult as an outsider sometimes to be able to sort out the ones that will be helpful and the ones that are probably just a nice shiny front end with not much behind. And also it's outside the scope of what we can do within the Flex. We can't sort of say, well, XYZ company's product is great, but ABC company's product is rubbish. So I'm afraid that's one place where I think people are going to have to continue to sort of try and see what's on the market. But hopefully the Flex will enable them to ask some questions that will help identify the products that might be of use to them.
Sorry, Chloe, you were going to say something.
Yes, I was. I mean, absolutely, completely agree with what Ian just said. Obviously, I'm in the same position from IEMA. We're not sort of going to sort of endorse one company over another, but something we would say from sort of IEMA position is that rather than going straight to spend-based data, if you can get actual data on emissions rather than using spend as a proxy, that is always preferable because it's more accurate. So yes, only use spend-based data if it's an absolute last resort. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I remember that was kind of a point that we made when we were talking before in the focus group, that, you know, the good spend-based versus actual data, which was important. So yeah.
If at the risk of telling people things they already know, if I can just come in and on that one and say that spend-based data is a method where you estimate a carbon footprint of an organization by effectively getting a bit of software to interrogate your account system. And your account system is obviously split between different categories. So we'll spend so much on electricity, but we'll also spend so much on paper, and we'll spend so much on rubbish disposal, etc., etc. And it just sort of applies standard carbon conversion factors to each of the categories in your accounting system. And I think, and I definitely agree with Chloe on this, that actually if you've got more detailed information, always try and use the more detailed information because it's going to be better.
Thanks very much. So I don't know, Philippa, are there any questions coming in that you can?
We have had one question, and I think we may have covered it in the previous discussions, but just to reiterate, this question asks, does the standard also include how to measure greenhouse gas emissions and reporting?
I'll jump in that case and basically say no. It doesn't seek to repeat what's available in other standards like that. So, for example, it does point people to say, if you want to use ISO 14064 Part 1, which is the greenhouse gas quantification and reporting standard, that's one route. Or if you want to use the suite of standards within the GHG protocol corporate standard, that's another route you can use. I think it also refers to the fact that in the UK, a lot of very small organisations, micro-organisations, will probably just work from the annual spreadsheets produced by DESNIS jointly with DEFRA, which, although they're advertised as being conversion factors, actually also give you a very good basis as to how to decide what to, or how to calculate your emissions.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. That's helpful. I note that there's some confusion here from our organisers. They think we're ending at 11:30. I thought we were actually we're in great time for midday. In which case we probably won't go all the way to midday. But I would say that we weren't going to finish at 11:30. So we just hopefully we'll carry on a little bit longer with some questions. Are there any other responses to that question? Or I think Ian's probably covered off what we're doing with the Flex pretty well there. So any other questions, Philippa?
Yes, we do. We have another one here. How does the BSI Flex link with IEMA resources and the ISO 14001 environmental management system?
I mean, it links very well, because obviously IEMA's had the chance to review the Flex, and you shouldn't find any contradictions between the Flex and what IEMA is saying. It depends on the question that you've got. Of course, there might be some questions which are outside the scope of the Flex that are available, answers to which are available elsewhere within IEMA publications. If the person who asked the question had any specific question, sort of drilling into that, I'm happy to take it.
And if I take the ISO side, it's designed to be effectively complementary to the sort of processes that might be established if an organisation's got an ISO 14001 environmental management system. In some ways, it possibly is more closely linked to ISO 50001, which is the energy management system, because so much of what we see in certainly scope 1 and scope 2, certainly direct and electricity or energy use emissions, is tied in with energy rather than within the wider supply chain.
We also have another question. How many SMEs have acquired net zero status in Europe?
A difficult one for us to know, but anybody have any thoughts on that?
I don't know the direct answer to that. All I do know is that the UN Race to Zero that was mentioned earlier, that has already thousands of SMEs that have signed up to that across the world. So there's a substantial sort of movement of people sort of doing that, both planning and targeting, and many more who won't have be doing something along these lines, I think was highlighted earlier. So it's and that group is growing, has been doubling year over year.
That's really good. Yeah, thanks. Anybody got any thoughts?
I think I'd actually also come in on that and just say that, of course, most of the time net zero is not something you are now, it's something you will be at some point in the future. So you've got a commitment to net zero, you've got a transition pathway to net zero, a transition plan to net zero, but you're probably not there yet. And I suspect not many organisations have managed to get there yet.
We have another question. Does Flex 3030 explain relationships to other standards on sustainability, resilience, etc.? As a single person SME, I don't have much time to spend on understanding the broader context and essential pillars.
Well,
resilience is certainly mentioned. It's also mentioned in the context of adaptation. One thing we recognised when drawing up the Flex is that a long-term plan should not just be about reducing emissions, it should not just be about mitigation, but it may also recognise that over that period there's going to be a need to adapt to the effects of climate change.
any others coming in, Philippa?
Not at the moment that I can see.
Okay, there were a couple that I was wondering about. Net zero and also costs. I did that one.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. You sort of broke up.
Did I? Oh, I'm sorry. I was just looking at a question that that we'd had earlier about net zero and use of old technologies and how people are supposed to manage with that issue. And I think it's about the costs of actually replacing things. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or advice on that particularly.
We do have another question that's just come in. If you are a business where staff travel internationally to train customers, attend conferences and support distributors, how can we move towards net zero without reducing this necessary activity?
We've got a similar business. So a lot of our employees are based at customer plants globally. And we also do a lot of training with customers as well on the use of our ink. And it's been a huge challenge. I have to say, since COVID, it's probably been the one positive thing that's come out of COVID is that because of the investment in technology, in teams and things like that, and because of the necessity, well, sort of the restrictions, I should say, on travel, a lot of measures have been put in place subsequently, and it's meant that we've got, you know, processes in place that mean that the training doesn't always have to be done in person. So we've been looking at alternatives, and that has actually proven to work quite well. So I think sometimes it's re-looking at it and saying, actually, do you know what? Do we need to do this in person? And then, you know, we've also had to recognise that there is a certain amount of travel that we have to do as a business. It is essential. And then looking at, you know, offsetting it. And I know everybody, there's real mixed reaction to offsetting it, but sometimes there are options that we need to look at as a business, because it's, of course, it's central to our business that we do some travel. So those are the options that we're looking at the moment.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
I think I'd agree largely with Elizabeth. I think also within Europe there are increasing opportunities to use high-speed train, which has a considerably lower carbon footprint than short-haul flights. Indeed, in fact, in France, I think they're actually talking about banning domestic flights for that very reason, to encourage people to use the HGVs. Sorry, not the HGVs, the TGVs. But there obviously is a limit to that. And with my tongue slightly in my cheek, I can point out that I did actually manage to attend an ISO meeting in Beijing by train, but only one way. And I think the footprint of taking the train there was probably just about as much as the footprint of flying there. So you have to do the balancing. As far as offsetting is concerned, it may be necessary to regard some travel emissions, particularly with air, in the future as being the so-called residuals, where there will still be a need to do some sort of long-term offsetting. In the short term, if you're interested in offsetting, then you're possibly aiming more for what's sometimes known as carbon neutrality, which is where you intend you in the short term balance out all your current emissions by purchasing carbon credits. And I'll give a plug for a very good ISO standard 14068 Part 1, which focuses on carbon neutrality and the steps that need to be taken for it.
I think this is a really nice question because it actually gets to the heart of like the intersection of all the different things and challenges that kind of businesses have to think about, from the sort of the practical best practice to target business travel specifically. And we've seen companies do things like introduce new policies, have flow charts to help people make decisions about whether they should fly or not, have like a little internal carbon dashboard for people so they can see their emissions from their flying, give them behavioral tips for the things they can do, from trains to changing the class of travel to joining more trips to doing more virtual, as Elizabeth was highlighting. There's lots that sort of the employee can do. There's things that the company can do in terms of those policies and things like that. But then there's also the wider thing. Well, what about your supplier, the airline? What are they going to do? And so sort of it also starts to link into bigger policy discussions about things like sustainable aviation fuel and others. So it really shows both the complexity when you dig into each area, but also that there are things that you can do kind of immediately from the small to the big, some of which will have cost savings as well. But then all wrapped in the wider one of, I think as Chloe was saying, just ensuring that you're focusing on the most material or the easiest to do first. So it might be that that's just not the place to start. There might be other areas to look at. So I think it kind of ties into everything we've been talking about, I think.
As a supplementary, if I can just add, if they're flying long haul around the world, send everyone economy class. It's got about the third the carbon footprint of business class, and you may suddenly find people are less interested in offering training face to face if they've got to fly economy, and a cost saving.
I was going to add that it sort of this really highlights the importance of having a transition plan in the first place, because your hierarchy, you look at what your baseline of emissions is, you look at how you're planning to grow as an organization, and how you think you're going to achieve that. And having a sort of carbon reduction plan, a transition plan, should be part of your forward business strategy as you plan for how you're going to achieve your growth. And so that, the greenhouse gas management hierarchy that IEM has always championed is sort of eliminate your emissions where you can, reduce them, substitute by changing technologies, and then finally, as Ian said, offsetting as a final step, sort of the compensation. But I think having a transition plan is almost like a forward budget for your company, a forward plan for your emissions and what you're going to do about them. So I think that's where things like this Flex are really helpful.
Thanks. I think thanks everybody for your questions. We do have others, but I can't sort of scan down them at the same time. So unless Philip has got another one that's come in that we think is burning,
we've had a number that have come in. One that I think might be of use for the panel to discuss is, how should SMEs approach calculating supplier Scope 3 emissions?
I mean, this is a huge challenge for SMEs because in a lot of cases, we haven't got the leverage of the clout to sort of force the issue, if you like. It's something that we're looking at the moment because we've been starting to do some rough calculations on Scope 3. This is going to be the significant proportion of our Scope 3, and actually in our greenhouse gases in its entirety. So we are starting to have that conversation with our supply chain. But again, it's down to resource as much as anything, and having that leverage. But what we're doing is we're starting to set our stall out and starting to have the conversation with our key suppliers. So we're prioritising who are our largest ones and starting to have that chat with them to understand where are they up to on their sustainable journey and in terms of collecting their greenhouse gas data. But it is a huge challenge.
Thanks. Anybody else want to come in on that, or are we? No? Oh, you're speaking, Ian, but I can't hear you.
I was just going to repeat what I said earlier about the fact that although there are some systems which will purport to give you an estimate based on what you've got in your accounting system, probably the best thing is actually just to look at what you're doing on a case-by-case basis. You don't necessarily need to know the carbon footprint of everything you're purchasing. You can very often just tell this is going to be a high carbon, this is going to be a low carbon, and then try and carry out some sort of materiality analysis. And I know for a small business that might sound like it's going to be far too difficult and far too hard, but sometimes it's just applying common sense to where the big sources likely to be.
Yeah, it's about prioritising, isn't it? And I think the good thing about the journey is it's recognising that the most important thing is to start, have that conversation, and recognise that it isn't going to be, you know, the accuracy will develop over time. We recognise at the beginning it's going to be very much a rough calculation, and it's highlighting which of the key suppliers and starting to work with them, and then broaden it out over time. It's not trying to cover all suppliers at the same time and engage with them all. It's prioritisation that's essential.
Yeah, and actually a funny one is you can do things like using feedback. So many suppliers these days will, after you've used them, will send you a feedback form. Use things like feedback forms to say, well, I'm thinking about moving my business away from you because you can't tell me the carbon footprint.
I think that point that Elizabeth was making there about prioritisation gets to a very important sort of mindset part of this part of Scope 3, but all of them together, which is this idea that you do want to be making progress, but you're not looking for perfection at the moment. So if you read like the sustainability report of Apple, like a $3 trillion company, they will still talk about the fact they're learning and improving, and they may even be using some spend-based measures in places. So everybody is in the same place. I was listening to one of the FTSE 100 company recently. They currently do it in Excel. That's fine too. And so it's just kind of getting to that point that at the moment, if we need to cut collectively by 50% by 2030, it's about kind of being directionally right rather than precisely accurate. And so just get started and keep going. Yeah,
I think it's not to worry too much about how accurate you are at the moment. Doing something's better than nothing.
We have a quite a general question, but I suspect lots of people may have this question in the back of their mind. What is the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality?
Again, if I can jump in first on that one. Carbon neutrality is where you are is done along where you are on the journey. So you've done your calculations of your footprint, you've done some reductions, you may even have done some removals, but that's unlikely. And you're still left with an unabated carbon footprint, unabated greenhouse gas emissions. At that point, you decide to counterbalance them by purchasing carbon credits, which are tradable instruments that you can go out and market, and you are basically paying someone else to go away and save a ton of carbon on your behalf. It's to be seen as an interim stage on the journey to net zero. And it's something that's optional. You don't have to do it, but it's something that obviously helps at a global level because it gets financing through to projects, perhaps in countries like Africa, on continents like Africa or parts of South Asia, which would not otherwise be able to afford to decarbonize their own activities. But so carbon neutrality is on the way. Net zero is the destination, whether or not you're doing just net zero or whether you're doing carbon neutrality at the same time.
And does that include other sort of greenhouse gas management, or is it just the carbon neutrality part of that?
So certainly within the ISO definition of carbon neutrality, it includes all greenhouse gases. So it includes the full IPCC basket, including sort of methane and sulfur hexafluoride and nitrogen trifluoride and perfluorocarbons and chlorofluorocarbons. And I've probably forgotten one there, nitrous oxide. So yes, it includes everything, and it's part of the process. Carbon neutrality at its worst is when someone just goes away and buys a few credits and thinks, I'm now carbon neutral, without having taken any action, without having any plan to reduce emissions.
Yeah. Which is not to be encouraged at this point when we're trying to get.
It's not to be encouraged. Sometimes it's the first step of an organisation or a person realising they need to do something, but it's not sustainable in the long term because it doesn't actually reduce the emissions at source, which is the key thing. And it's also not financially stable because it actually gets very expensive to do that. Much better to reduce your emissions and save money that way.
Start this journey in a more sustainable way.
And finally, I have one final question for all the panel. What does the panel think is the best way of keeping up to date, finding information on new technologies that can aid businesses on the pathway to net zero?
Need that repeated? Or that? Sorry.
I was going to say it's quite difficult to know because it depends which sector you're in as to what sort of technologies we're talking about.
I mean,
that's a very good point, Chloe. And I think a lot of people are in trade associations and actually you can get information from the trade association, from sort of business groups. I probably should be corporate here and say sort of look at the SME hub on the that Sasha was telling us about earlier, but it's early days for that yet.
I mean, for us at our business, we are linked with the BCF, British Coatings Federation, and I have to say they've been phenomenal at providing information, updates on a whole raft of topics. So I would certainly reiterate what you said, Chloe, look at your trade association because they're often a really good source of information. And if they don't know, they're quite happy to, you know, they've got the connections to ask other members as well for their advice and link you with them as well. So they've been excellent, certainly for us as a coatings and ink industry.
I think as well, I mean, a bit of a plug for IEMA, if the trade association isn't up, you know, doesn't have the information it needs, it should definitely get in contact with IEMA because we do work with trade bodies as well. So and share insights around members. So that could be helpful if your trade association isn't on board yet.
Well, I think unless there's one other, I might draw the questions and answers session to a close for now, because I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to say a few words about their own thoughts as we wrap up. But just before we wrap up, a few words perhaps about the next steps for the Flex. Ian, we did actually have a lot of downloads for the first version, which is great. So I hope people in SMEs are actually being able to use it and getting the most from those practical step-by-step recommendations in there. What are the next stages in development of the content?
Well, we've had a formal consultation period which finished a couple of weeks ago now, and out of that we had something like 100 specific comments, and I as technical author have been working through those, and in fact most of them are very good ideas and good suggestions, and we will then incorporate that into a second draft version which will be discussed with the advisory group, and that's the whole concept of an idea of a flex will then be used as a basis for a second published version, which I think is likely to be sometime at the end of the year. By looking at Sarah.
Yeah, I think late October, November time. I think we were thinking there would be the second version, but in the meantime, the version that's there is still extant and can be used. It won't it won't change radically. We're hoping to improve the language and the accessibility and some of the content there, particularly sort of around maybe more diagrams, perhaps. I think was your suggestion there. I think you were going to mention maybe some more case study material, as we talked about just in that last poll. Was there anything else that you wanted to add, Ian, or is that probably we're just going to have a meeting probably of the advisory group in the summer, start working through some of the comments, and say there'll be another version for everybody to look at towards the end of the year. Anyway, thank you everybody, and in the meantime, please do continue to feedback on the use of the existing Flex. As I said, it stays current until replaced in the autumn, or towards the end of the year. And do please keep letting us know what else might be useful in the space via the hub and the community, which will continue to be that focal resource for net zero standards. And now, just our final question for our panelists today. If you could give one piece of advice, I'm going to come to each of you just before we close. If you give one piece of advice to small businesses about net zero and their role in transition, what would you say to them based on your own experience and thinking? Ian, first of all?
Go for it.
Sorry, what was that?
Go for it.
Go for it. Thank you.
Don't hang around waiting for the perfect opportunity all the time. Or just go for it. Just do it.
Do it. Chloe?
I would say start before it's desperate. So you may not feel like you need to do it just yet, but you might find that a key client suddenly asks you for your data, and suddenly you've got to scramble to get your data ready. And if you're a small organization with not many staff, you're going to have to put all your other work on hold while you scramble to get this together, and it could be quite disruptive. So start before it gets desperate.
Elizabeth?
I think see it as it's not a sort of specific project, but embed it into your business as much as possible, so that sustainability should be a consideration for all areas of the business. It's not a project for one person. It involves absolutely everybody and everything that everybody does every single day, whether it be switching the lights off, whether it's your capital investment, whatever it is. It's making sure that you consider the impact that decision or that action has on the environment, and everybody has a part to play in it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And James?
Yeah, mine's sort of a combo of all the above. It's, yeah, get your plan together, involve as many people as you can, and think all the time, progress, not perfection.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. That was some great thoughts there. And thanks to all our participants for your questions and input too. And remember, standards making is all about everyone who has an interest and relevance in that work and topic, having a say and inputting. So please do give us feedback on this and on the Flex. Register on the hub. Hopefully we'll all be able to support each other on this road that we're all on to make a difference by moving us towards a more sustainable and net zero world. And with that, our time is up. Thank you very much, Ian, Chloe, Elizabeth, James, Sasha, and Philippa for fielding those questions, and to everyone who tuned in, especially those who submitted those questions. We did get through a lot, and as I say, as Sasha mentioned, we'll hopefully put them on the hub and answer some of those later. For everyone who registered for the event today, you'll receive an email shortly with all the links and resources mentioned today in the webinar, and the video to watch again on demand. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
And welcome back, everybody. I really hope that was useful to all of you. And now I'm inviting the panel who you saw just then to come back into the room, as it were, and give you all an update, all of you who've tuned in, on the development of the Flex's next and final version, and also give you an opportunity to ask you any questions that occurred to you whilst you were watching the webinar. The current Flex and the new version, which is due out in November this year, will still be available as a free online resource. As we mentioned earlier, you can access the current version, and the new version will be accessible in November. This is the panel who were introduced in the recording just now, but very quickly again, this Chloe, Policy and Engagement Lead for AIMA, Liz, who's the ESG Director from inks, specialist inks and manufacturer for packaging, James, founder of Geeky, a B Corp helping people cut carbon emissions, and finally Ian, last but not least, Ian, a chartered environmentalist and accountant with over 30 years experience in energy efficiency, renewables and carbon management. Also my colleagues Sasha and who's the community hub manager, and Philippa, who's the project editor and manager for the project, the Flex project. Firstly, over to Ian, who's going to give us an overview of what you can expect in the ongoing Flex development, and Chloe, James and Elizabeth who have all been involved in the work that we've been doing on this last week or so, will chip in, I'm sure, with their own thoughts about this. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Sarah. The advisory group has met 4 times in the last week and a half, and I'm very thankful to the support and advice that they've been giving in the process. We had incorporated quite a number of ideas from the public consultation into the first draft of version 2. There were an additional 159 comments in the end, some of which were quite small, like people sort of spelt a word wrongly, or we had a particular problem spelling the word world, I understand, but some of which were quite significant. And we've taken those on board as far as possible where we think that they are appropriate and will be helpful to the users. We've also at this stage written and added an annex taking users of the standard through a case study in a somewhat fictitious hotel, possibly based somewhere on the south coast of England or somewhere similar, to see how an organisation like that, which would just be a typical very small business, would actually approach developing its own net zero transition pathway.
Thanks, Ian. Does anybody want to add anything from their experience of working on the Flex this week, and feels like there was something particularly important to kind of highlight at this point about what was going into it and the changes that might have been made? James.
You're on mute, James. Ooh, you're not.
Doesn't look like you're on mute, but
no, I was going to say.
Still on mute.
An hour and a half ago, we could hear James perfectly, but
yes, of course, yeah.
While we wait for James, I'll just chip in, assuming you can hear me okay.
Yes.
To say that it's an incredible amount of work actually going through it really line by line and picking through exactly what we meant by every single word. And there's a lot of work that goes into producing these documents that is quite a commitment from not just us here on the call, but other people as well who've been part of it. And it's really fantastic to see how much input people have put in actually, and the time that people have taken to read it and submit their comments. So anyway, over to James, whose microphone hopefully now works.
I don't know if that's any better.
Yes, we can hear you.
Extraordinary. Yeah, I was just going to highlight the consultation, the clarity, the helpfulness, the ability to implement using it. I think that's what's really come from a lot of the feedback. So I think it's a stronger, very useful for the context, a more useful document.
Yeah, and on that, those points, actually, I'd just like to say that one of the key things that, you know, it's a lot of work to make something accessible and simple and clear, and not too long and effortful. I always think about Mark Twain writing a letter saying, "I'm sorry it was so long, I didn't have time to make it shorter," which, you know, is you know, we're trying to make this really kind of concise and clear for everybody. So that's been incredible, the efforts that people have been making on that score. Does anyone else have anything there, or shall we move to I know there were a few questions that came in, but actually I mean, should we do some questions first, or maybe we should ask Sasha to give us a quick update on the hub itself and anything that we're thinking about doing with that. I know we are thinking about doing things with that. So can we do that, and then we'll go to I know we've had a few live questions come in. Sasha, I invite you to say anything about the plans we have for the hub.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so thank you to all. I can see that many of you have joined the hub during the course of the webinar, and it's great to see you there. In terms of the hub, so we will be sharing updates as the Flex is being developed. So we'll share a little bit more insights before we go kind of live, and let you know when the version 2 is up and ready for review and for you to kind of view and browse. And then we will also be sharing kind of other developments and updates that we've got as part of broader BSI work within the net zero space. So that looks at some of the other insights from the Net Zero Week that we have. We've got updates on COP, which is coming up, and kind of what you can expect, and looking at more of an SME view on that. Yeah, and I think that pretty much covers it. But welcome to some of our newest members.
Thanks, Sasha. We're really hoping to make this a really helpful, interactive community about the standards and about that exist now, but also, you know, how the Flex is developing. But also, there's obviously there's work there on the there's a access to the free environment energy management system standard sort of implementation guide step by step, and there's work with the net zero barometer, and there's also you know, we hope to sort of provide some interactivity and comms on the development of the new net zero aligned organisations standard that is being developed in ISO now. Will be available in a few years, or two years, I think it is. But that is also, there's a lot of net zero standard support activity that we hope you'll be able to access via this community, and also ask your own questions there as well. Thanks. So perhaps I can go to Philippa and ask if for any of the questions that came in.
Thank you, Sarah. The first question we have is, as a small SME, we actually have a small carbon impact in scopes 1 and 2, and have already in place a lot of carbon reducing elements, heat pumps, LEDs, etc. Our struggle, therefore, is to continually reduce emissions, as we've essentially reached our benchmark and are now waiting for the grid to decarbonise. Do you agree that SMEs can effectively narrate this within their plans? We are starting our Scope 3 exploration, but this will take some time before we have any useful data.
Thanks, Philippa. Who would like to go first on that? Ian?
Yeah, I'm quite prepared to jump in. Essentially, yes, the answer is a plan has to recognise and reflect what can be done. There's no point having a plan that's unachievable. So if the plan says, well, we're going to concentrate on scope 1, and in the first couple of years we're going to more or less eliminate our scope 1, or certainly reduce it very much through things like the heat pumps you mentioned, that's great. We recognise that as far as grid decarbonisation, the government has reiterated its target of getting, I think, there by 2030. I think some of us in the industry regard that as being a little bit optimistic, but it's certainly for the indirect so-called Scope 2 emissions of electricity the way to go. And so gradually we would expect to see people planning to move between direct combustion activities and then moving towards electrically powered activities where they can take advantage of the decarbonisation of electricity. So then, as you say, or as the questioner says, that then leaves the Scope 3s, which are typically things like purchased goods or services, or perhaps things that downstream if you're marketing a product in terms of the use of that product. The downstream side is probably easier to address first, but it's the upstream, it's the purchases, it's the knowing where stuff comes from that can be quite difficult. And there it is very much about allowing yourself time to be able to identify sources, identify what the likely emissions are. It doesn't actually have to be particularly accurate at this stage. It's just really a question of finding where the big ones are and whether there's anything that can be done in terms of product substitution or in terms of talking to your suppliers and saying, do you have a lower carbon alternative to this perhaps?
I might just add to that. Firstly, congratulations to the questioner for getting there. But
Yeah,
also, as you think about measuring your Scope 3, notwithstanding that, there are things you can start to think that you can act on within Scope 3 before you have the numbers. So there'll be the things that you can control a bit more directly, like business travel, waste, commuting and home working to some degree. And then, as Ian was highlighting, then you've really got to sort of think about the purchased goods and services with the hotspots being a key thing for that you get from the measurement. So you're ahead. I think you sound like you're kind of well ahead of many, many companies. That's one way if you want to stay ahead, something you could do.
Thanks, James.
I can't add to those because they're really fantastic points, but and it's very difficult to give advice without knowing what sector the person asking the question is from. But having got to that point, it might be interesting to look at circular economy business models and to see whether there's anything that can be done to reduce life cycle emissions of product, if indeed it's a product that they're making. So that might be the next leap.
Yes, thank you. The circular economy is a very good point there. I hope that was helpful. Philippa, have we got another question at all?
We do. This is more of a comment than a question, but I think the panel could still address it. There are two streams here. Those who already need to comply with ESOS and SECR, and SMEs who've had no legislative driver but supply to them.
That's right. I mean, that's a fair point. And I think one of the things that we have felt when we were going through the process of scoping the study, which was referred to in the taped section of the webinar, was that the voluntary end of it, perhaps the smaller ones who don't have to comply with ESOS or SECR, have really been a bit underserved, and they've been left very much to their own devices as to whether or not they set a plan, but also actually as to what to do in terms of getting towards net zero. And yet collectively, small enterprises sort of constitute probably more than half the businesses and at least a quarter of the carbon emissions within the UK. So they are an important group, but historically have been underserved. I should also add that as far as ESOS is concerned, ESOS is the Energy Savings Opportunities Scheme, which has been extended to carbon, but that with the change of government, the delay of the relaunch of ESOS and the new rules, and indeed a new publicly accessible standard, PAS 5.12.15, parts 1 and part 2, has been delayed again, but is likely to be published sometime between now and the end of the year. We don't know the exact dates.
I might just add to that, there are lots of different rationales and reasons why companies might choose to go along this path, but we touched on it a bit in the recording, that the sort of underlying it, sort of the business need to kind of make money, save money, protect reputation. It doesn't really matter what your rationale is. And and within sustainability, there are ones that can cover off all of those points. So notwithstanding the good point about where they are for the reason, there's lots of things to focus on.
Thank you.
In terms of doing things sort of voluntarily rather than because you have to, because of regulation, the IFRS has just published a paper today called Voluntarily Applying ISSB Standards. I've just put a link in the chat, but I think actually, Sarah, I can only email you in the chat. So if you think that's helpful, feel free to share it with everybody. I've not read it. I don't know what it says, but it might be useful.
Thanks, Chloe. I think the organisers, our event organisers, will probably be able to share that with the attendees. Thank you very much. Thank you, Doris. Yeah, that was helpful. Ian, did you want to come back in there or not? No.
Other than to say that the Flex is very much aimed at helping people give the advice and actually to set up a plan and then execute it, to implement it, rather than simply as a reporting standard. And a lot of the actions we have seen are about reporting this and reporting that, but not focusing as much on the doing.
Yeah, and that has been the focus for the Flex for sure. Philippa, are there any other comments or questions?
Yes, we do. We have another question. With the mention of grants for businesses, is there somewhere that has a list of all the grants available?
That was me in the last webinar. I was talking about local authority grants.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm not aware of a central list of grants, but it might be worth looking at your own local authority. Generally, local authorities will have a business development team that are there to support SMEs in the area to grow and develop. So they might be able to direct you to local lists, depending on where you are in the country.
I think also Chamber of Commerce are usually quite a good source of information as well. I know our local one, the Greater Manchester one, they send updates on grants and things, and so do the BCF, the trade organisation as well, so they can be quite good sources of information as well.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Do we have any others, Philippa, or?
We do. Is there a list of things to attain net zero such that SMEs can help big businesses to help them in terms of electrical, electronics and software solutions, which as an SME we're expert in?
Who would like to take that first? Any thoughts?
To answer the specific questions, there isn't a definitive list because it depends very much on the organisation itself as to what it can and should do. As a general rule, and again, I think Chloe mentioned this in the recorded section, that there is a hierarchy that you should start doing, which is by starting off by looking at reducing emissions, and then moving towards perhaps removals or substitution through switching to, say, green energy, for example, in certain circumstances, and then only then looking at other approaches. But I don't think that was really answering your question, because I suspect that the question was more about that first stage in terms of the reductions as to what you should be doing.
Certainly there's a regular argument about decarbonising your business is good for business in general, and if you're in the business of helping organisations decarbonise their own operations, then that would exactly be the selling point. I may have, if I've understood the question correctly, I think that's generally the direction it was perhaps going in.
Great. Okay, so any others, Philippa? Oh, it's gone very quiet. Philippa's gone quiet. Maybe I've lost Philippa. No.
No, you haven't. I'm right here.
Good.
No, actually, I don't think we do have anything, any other questions at the moment. No, I think that's where we are. Those are all the ones we've received thus far.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks all of you who've asked questions. We've got certainly before I sort of wrap up, we've got some resources to share with you about things like you know, as we said, the hub and the various issues around the various things on the Flex itself and on the new standards that are due to be developed. We've also just so you're aware, with BSI are piloting a new membership offer for micro organisations, just to give access to the Knowledge Digital Library, which has got about 90,000 standards in it for a much discounted rate. And there's a form that you can fill in if your SME is interested in that. And finally, before I close down, just to remind you all, you've got the Flex is still available as it is. The changes are going to be all about tightening things up and improving and giving more clarity, and we can certainly be explaining what some of those things are in the community of the Net Zero Standards Hub itself. And you'll see it in its final state in a couple of months in November. But meanwhile, just a final question for all our panelists. Is there one piece of advice you'd give right now? I know I asked a similar question at the end of the recorded webinar, but just, given where we're at the moment, and given that COP is coming up, COP29, we're in New York Climate Week at the moment, is there anything that you think should be top of mind for SMEs right now that we might not have covered just now, or that you think might be well emphasized at this point? Can I start with Chloe, and then we go around?
I would say, in addition, last time I said do it before it's desperate. I would say perhaps talk to other people in your sector around the country and see what they're up to and how they're going along, because quite a lot of the guidance is around sectoral guidance. I think we sort of talk about this a little bit in the Flex, and that could help you work with peers and share best practice. Apologies if I've repeated something somebody else said in the last one.
I think all of this bears repetition, actually, but there you are. Liz, would you like to go next?
I think the thing that I've learned is just be really transparent. So even if you've made a mistake, that there's integrity behind it and that there's an honesty, so that you're sort of saying, well, this is what I did because I thought that was the right thing to do, and then you can always correct it. I know it was mentioned last time, don't look for perfection, certainly not at this stage. Just start, but just be really transparent about what you've done, what you've included, what assumptions you've made, where the data's come from, and then there's real integrity behind what you've done.
Thanks. James?
It's actually the theme of New York Climate Action Week this week is basically it's time to act, and I think that's the one. Just get going with the implementation.
Thanks, James. And finally, I'm going to give our technical author and chair of the
last time I was very brief and just said go for it. This time I'll be a little bit longer and say don't worry too much about COP29 and New York Climate Week. It makes good sense to start on the journey now. Makes good business sense. You don't have to be in New York or Baku. You could be, for example, in York or Bognor Regis, and it still makes good sense.
Thank you, Ian. And thanks everyone for registering and joining the event today. You'll shortly get an email with all the links and resources and the video to watch on demand. Thank you to the panel again, and I shall now sign off, but thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.